Good afternoon, and thank you all very much for coming. My name is Shem. I'm a fourth year in the School of Medicine, and on behalf of the Gold Humanism Honor Society, I want to welcome all of you. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to just take a moment to thank our sponsors for this lecture. This lecture was sponsored by a grant from the Arnold P. Gold Foundation. In addition, we received generous contributions the medical school's chapter of the American Medical Association Medical Students Section, from the Medical Alumni Association, and from Dr. Richard Colgan of the Department of Family and Community Medicine. Our thanks to all of them for making this lecture possible. In the fall of 1988, Dr. Arnold P. Gold, a pediatric neurologist at Colombian University, created the foundation that bears his name because he felt that the phenomenal advances in medicine in the 20th century had dwarfed the essential humanistic elements, resulting in new physicians who were academically brilliant, but who often lacked caring and compassion. The Arnold P. Gold Foundation and the Gold Humanism Honor Society were established to restore the practice of medicine. At the University of Maryland, members of the Gold Humanism Honor Society are selected through a peer voting process and faculty review during the third year of medical school, with the goal of selecting rising seniors that most demonstrate the ideal traits that Dr. Gold saw in the compassionate physician. Earning membership in the Gold Humanism Honor Society is one of two honors that is noted on the medical student performance evaluation that goes out with every fourth-year medical student's residency applications, the other honor being membership in the Alpha Omega Alpha Medical School Honor Society. At medical schools across the country, the Gold Humanism Honor Society sponsors the annual White Coat Ceremony, in which members of the freshman class of medical students receive their white coats and take the Hippocratic Oath as they formally become practitioners of medicine. In addition, at the University of Maryland, our chapter sponsors an annual service project. This year, on April 11th, we partnered with Habitat for Humanity to build safe homes in our community. Our goal is to promote the ideals of compassionate patient care and to raise awareness as to the issues that hinder physicians' abilities to engage in such care. And there's perhaps nobody who is more keenly aware of these issues than our speaker this afternoon. Dr. Steven Bergman did his undergraduate training at Harvard University, which included doing neurosurgical research right here in Baltimore as part of his senior honors thesis. He also attended Oxford University in the United Kingdom under a Rhodes Scholarship before enrolling at Harvard Medical School, where he earned his MD. It was Dr. Bergman's experiences during his internship at Beth Israel Hospital in Boston that inspired him to write his first and most famous novel, The House of God. Written under the pen name of Samuel Shem, The House of God has been described as a novel that, through its biting satire and vivid imagery, does for medicine what Joseph Heller's novel Catch-22 did for the military. Although condemned by the medical community when it was first published in 1978, over the past 3 decades, The House of God has become one of the most widely read and most widely respected books in the medical field, and has been named by the prestigious medical journal Lancet as one of 2 most important medical novels of the 20th century. The Harvard Club of New York writes that Samuel Shem is easily the finest and most important writer to ever focus on the lives of doctors and the world of medicine. Dr. Bergman is the author of 4 novels, his most recent being The Spirit of the Place, which won 2 National Best Novel of the Year awards, as well as numerous essays, several nonfiction works, and an off-Broadway play entitled Bill W. and Dr. Bob, about the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, which won the Performing Arts Award of the National Council on Alcohol. Dr. Bergman is a psychiatrist and served on the faculty at Harvard Medical School as a clinical instructor of psychiatry for 35 years. He is the winner of numerous awards, has given the commencement address at over 50 medical schools across the country, and had the honor of giving the Arnold P. Gold Humanism and Medicine Lecture at the 2008 annual meeting of the Association of American Medical Colleges. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Steven Bergman.
Yes, yes. Amazing. One of the things, thank you, Hemel. It's a great honor to be here. One of the things that I also wanted to mention, this is the writer part, is that I will be doing a book signing after the talk. Is that right? There'll be books here or there or where? Yeah, you can buy the book and you can have my autograph, which will decrease the value of it. It's, as you heard, the university, this is the first time I've been back to the University of Maryland Medical School since the summer of 1965, when I was going into my senior year at Harvard College, and I had wandered into deciding that I would solve the mystery of the neurobiological basis of learning and memory. And that somehow involved spending the summer here working with a scientist named Robert Grinnell and learning this, as you heard, neurosurgical technique that you could perfuse a little section of cortex. And I went back to Harvard, and they gave me a lab at the Mass General, and I worked diligently on this. I was really enthusiastic about this. And it really was because of that, I think, that I then got lucky and got a Rhodes Scholarship to go to Oxford. Usually they don't include scientists, really, but they did in this case. And then my 3 years at Oxford really changed my life. Changed my life to get out of the country from 1966 to 1969. When I came back then, well, I started writing in Oxford when I got over there, and I decided I wanted to be a writer. And there was a little thing called the Vietnam War going on at that time. And so after the scholarship was up, you didn't get drafted if you were in a graduate program. So after the scholarship was up, I faced a not too difficult choice between Vietnam or Harvard Med. And so I chose Harvard Med, and I always wanted to be a writer, and I decided, okay, medicine will be my meal ticket. And then I finally decided to become a psychiatrist, partly because I would have my mornings free to write. And that worked out well for a number of years, and now I'm just a writer, so I'm finally being a little more productive. So I call this Staying Human in Medicine. It's a topic that I've been talking about for a long time. And I'll tell the story through my journey as a writer, basically. And I'll use some of my works as examples, of course, especially The House of God. And the theme of this, to keep in mind, is a very simple one that I've come to embrace in various different ways, and that is the danger of isolation and the healing power of good connection. The danger of isolation, the healing power of good connection. Well, as you heard, when the House of God came out in 1978, I wasn't the most favored person at places like the Harvard Medical School and the Beth Israel Hospital. In fact, I was roundly condemned, as you heard. And over the years, as you've heard, it's kind of gotten kosher. However, I recently found out that I have to be on my guard about the book. This was a potluck supper for our daughter Katie's class one time a few years ago, and I didn't know what to do. I'm sort of wandering around looking for someone to talk to, and I hear these two women talking, and I get closer. They're both doctors. Great. So I get closer. Doctors at the Beth Israel Hospital, my alma mater, something in common. I go over, sit down, wait for an opportunity. I say, you know, I may not be the most favorite doctor at the Beth Israel Hospital. And one of them looked at me and with venom said, well, you can't be as bad as that guy that wrote that book. And there was this delicious pause, right? And I said, well, I am the guy that wrote that book. And she blushed, beet red, and that was the last play date our daughter had with her daughter. The House of God had a terrible start. I never had written a novel before. I'd written other things, plays and poems and stuff. But when we entered our internship, we were idealists when we went to medical school, and when we entered internship, it was such a bad experience in some ways that I figured somebody had to write it. It's what I call what drives me as a writer is something I call "hey, wait a second" moments. And these are moments, you probably already had some today, where you find yourself thinking something or doing something or not doing something you think you should have done. You say, later you say, hey, wait a second, why did I just do that? Why did I think that? Why didn't I help that person? Or why did I do this? And in the internship, there were enough of these, hey, wait a second moments that I figured somebody had to tell about them, and that somebody was me. So I started writing The House of God as a catharsis, really, after what was and probably still is the worst year of my life. I was the story of how it got published is kind of interesting and ridiculous. I was looking for a play agent. I was in my psychiatric residency, and someone said there was this agent in New York who was a play agent, so I wrote her. I said, I'm looking for a play agent. P.S. I have a little bit of a doctor novel I've been kind of working on. And she wrote back and she said, well, I'm not a play agent, but why don't you send me what you got? Well, what I had, I didn't even know you're supposed to double space things, you know. And this was in the days of a typewriter. Remember, a typewriter is a kind of a box, big box-like thing with keys like a piano, you know. I sent it off. It had coffee rings on it. It was single space, scrawls in the margin, you know, cigar ash, pipe ash, God knows what else on it, you know. Sent it off. Forgot about it. Went on with my first year of psych training. So there I am one day, several weeks later, I'm standing in the secretary's office of McLean Hospital, where I was doing my training at Harvard Hospital. And the phone rings, the secretary says, it's so-and-so for you. And I didn't even recognize her name. And she says, oh, she says she's an agent. You sent her something. So I get on the phone, and this is my first feedback, right, of this mess. And her first words to me were, well, I don't know if you're a madman or a genius, but I really love what you sent me. And I had the presence of mind, actually, to say, well, I can't help you there, but you should know I'm speaking to you from within a mental institution at this time. So, you know, gradually, you know, nobody wanted to publish it. Gradually, I double-spaced and got a contract, you know. And I remember, it was rewritten 7 times. I seem to have to rewrite my novel 7 times for some reason. And it was just about to be published, and I met with the publisher, and he said, well, you know, we got to look at this legally. Are there any people in this novel that are identifiable? I'm thinking, oh, God, you know, who isn't, you know? And so I thought I'd kind of fudge it, and I said, well, yeah, actually there's one who's really identifiable. He's the chief of medicine. And so he asked me, I said, yeah, he looks like him, he acts like him, he talks like him, you know, all of his mannerisms are like him. And meanwhile, the guy says, oh, that's bad. And I'm thinking this book isn't going to get published, you know. And so he looks at me and he says, well, does he have a big red birthmark on his cheek? And I said, no, he doesn't. He said, well, now he has. And if you open your copy, the first, and I think only time it's mentioned, is that the chief of medicine has a birthmark on his, it's called the libel prevention birthmark. Right? In the small miracle department about the House of God all these years later, the places that hated me the most were Harvard Medical School and the Beth Israel Hospital. And lo and behold, a couple of years ago, guess who was the commencement speaker at Harvard Medical School? And even more amazing, guess who was invited to speak at the Beth Israel Hospital about a month ago? Right. So the message there for you young people is you live long enough, the people who hate you are either dead or retired. You know. When I told my buddies at Harvard Medical School that I'd been invited to give the commencement speech, my House of God buddies, I immediately got 3 emails. One of them said, they must really be hard up. We must really be in a depression. Right? The second one said, there must be some mistake. Are you sure it's not the commencement address at the Harvard liquor store on Mass Ave? And the third said, this is the end of civilization as we know it. Okay, what about the House of God? This is all in retrospect. You know, I was just trying to, as I say, it was a sort of a cathartic effort, and I was meeting with my friends who had been interns, and we'd talk, etc. But years later, what I realized is that we often at times of decision think we're making a decision based on some rational data or practical advice or whatever, and it turns out, looking back later on, you find out you hadn't the slightest idea of the historical and cultural forces that were driving you along, carrying you along at the time that you made that decision. And that became true years later as I look back on the House of God, because our generation was the ones who at college, we're in this brief, wonderful period of American history. We had this bizarre notion, if you saw an injustice or an inequality, like the 1% and 99% now, if you got together and took action, you could change things. What a bizarre idea, right? Well, we helped to put the civil rights laws on the books, and we ended the Vietnam War. Okay? So when we went into our internships, when I went into my internship at the Beth Israel, we just naturally were we just naturally thought that if we saw things we didn't think were right in medicine, we could resist them. And in fact, you can read the House of God as a kind of a novel of nonviolent resistance, the different ways that the different interns resisted what they saw was an unjust system. And that was what happened. We walked into this system as idealists, and we immediately felt ourselves in a conflict between the received wisdom of this big medical system and the call of the human heart. Simply put, we were, as in the book, we felt we were not being understood, and we were being forced to treat patients in ways that we didn't think were humane. And so naturally, we kind of took action. Let me read you a short, true piece. This actually happened in the House of God early in the year. It's about an intern called the Runt. The Runt was having a hard time. As he sat down to lunch, he took out a pill box, put a pill on his hamburger, and munched it down. When I asked what it was, he said, "Valium, vitamin V. I've never been so nervous in my life." Does the Valium help? Makes me feel kind of sleepy, but I feel pretty unflappable. I'm writing orders for it for all my patients. What? You're putting all of them on Valium too? Why not? He said. They're all very nervous having me as their doctor. After the others had left, the Runt said he had a confession to make. It's about my third admission last night. In the middle of all this trouble with the yellow man, this guy comes into emergency, and I couldn't handle it. I offered him $5 if he'd go home. He took it and left. True story. Try it next year for those of you who are graduating. And this other piece, short piece I'm going to read from the book is one of the joys of writing, actually. One of the things you can do as a fiction writer is if you've been in a situation and you're writing about it and you realize you didn't do the right thing and you wanted to kind of correct it, you can kind of do it in writing, and you'll see what I mean in this. The true part of this story is there was a woman who was a patient of mine, a middle-aged woman with metastatic breast cancer who had gone down to surgery that morning. The surgeons had opened her up. It was too widespread. They did nothing, and they just sent her back up to the ward. And she was there on the ward, conscious again, and nobody had come up and told her what they'd found. And so the nurse came up to me and said, you're an intern, you've got to tell her. And I said, look, I'm not, no, I was scared stiff, and we hadn't had any instruction in how you give patient bad news. I mean, this was the dark ages, And I said, it's her private doctor's responsibility, or maybe a nurse's or something. And that's as far as it went in reality. And I just walked away. I don't know who told her. But in the House of God, you'll see this passage if you're interested. This is what I wrote. When I came to write this, I said, well, this is what I don't know. It wasn't conscious. This is what I wrote. The fat man comes up. Overhears this. The fat man who is, is a hero of the House of God. Laws such as, at a cardiac arrest, the first procedure is to take your own pulse, right? And the fat man says he'll do it, right? And then this is the way it goes on. Roy describes the scene. I watched him enter her room and sit on the bed. The woman was 40. Thin and pale, she blended with the sheets. I pictured her spine x-rays, riddled with cancer, a honeycomb of bone. If she moved too suddenly, she'd crack a vertebra, sever her spinal cord, paralyze herself. Her neck brace made her look more stoic than she was. In the midst of her waxy face, her eyes seemed immense. From the corridor, I watched her ask Fats her question and then search him for his answer. When he spoke, her eyes pooled with tears. I saw the fat man's hand reach out and, motherly, envelop hers. I couldn't watch. Despairing, I went to bed. And then later that night, after seeing a patient, he returns. Roy glances into the room again. Fats was still there, playing cards, chatting. As I passed, something surprising happened in the game. A shout bubbled up, and both the players burst out laughing. So you see what I mean about being able to redo reality in fiction. And Actually, I've been told that if you think about it, that is really a good lesson for you who are about to go on the wards of how you deliver bad news to patients, right? He comes in, sits at eye level, lets her ask her question, answers it truthfully, and he doesn't run out the door. He sits there, and he doesn't say anything. And then we don't exactly know what happens, but he stays. He stays for a while, and then there is some healing that takes place, as I described. Hopefully, it doesn't always happen like that. So, in looking back, what are the lessons I've learned that I usually tell to medical students, especially about staying human in medicine? Well, it's very simple, and there are essays on the website that go into it in more detail. It's samuelshem.com, the website. The first and the most important, as I've already mentioned, is connection. Connection comes first. Once again, isolation is deadly and connection heals. And it's interesting, as we get more and more savvy about the difference between a patient, say, who's isolated in the hospital and one who has a whole family involved or friends, those people tend to do better in all kinds of things. Things you might think of, like, infections or recovery from surgery, but even in much more what we think impermeable or drastic things, like really serious illnesses, cancer and stuff. So I think without going into it too much, there's a lot of hints now, after all these years, that whatever the qualities are of a good connection with someone, they can affect the body, probably through the immune system, right? There are some studies that show immune response goes up, and an immune response can go down. I remember one study, if a doctor delivers bad news in a not a very empathic way versus really delivering it in a good way. So I think we're sort of getting a hint that connection in the physical world is as important as in the emotional and psychological world. And part of that is saying, connection not just in medicine. Medicine is part of life, not vice versa. I mean, one of the things that's really hard when you become a doctor is to keep your family going, your family connections going, your relationships going, right? And the one thing that a teacher of mine once said is that happiness is not an individual matter. That is, in America we're taught that, it's a self-actualizing, one might say self-centered culture compared to some others. But, and there's a lot about how to make yourself happy. But the fact is that happiness is not an individual matter. It's a matter of your connections with other people, your good connections with other people, which I'll get to later. People have, over the years, called The House of God a kind of a cynical book. But in response to that, I went through it, and I didn't see it as that so much when I wrote it. And it turns out there is one consistent, quote, message in The House of God that is pointed toward doing good in terms of connection. And that is the phrase, being with the patient. Now, I'll read you a couple of passages from the book, a couple of sentences. This is the fat man. I make my patients feel like they're part of life, part of some grand, nutty scheme instead of alone with their disease. With me, they still feel part of the human race. And let's see. Yeah. And this is a patient of Roy, the narrator's, Dr. Sanders. What sustains us is when we find a way to be compassionate, to love. And the most loving thing we do is be with the patient, like you're being with me. And then Roy, at the end of the book, says, what these patients wanted was what anyone wanted, the hand in their hand, the sense that their doctor could care. So even then, when I wasn't very wise about these things, I made a kind of a, what do they call it on the screen? You put a marker on the screen or something of your computer. You mark it as being with was important. The other three things I mentioned when I talk about how to staying human in medicine, are speaking up is the second one. Speaking up or speaking out. It's important when you see something that's not right in the medical system, that's unjust or unethical, that you speak out. Not only to call attention to it, but because speaking out is essential for your survival as a human being. If you witness some of these things and you keep it to yourself and you don't say anything, guaranteed you're going to suffer and you're going to spread more suffering around. The third thing is empathy. Learn empathy, and that's obvious. I said this to a second-year Harvard class I was teaching, seminar group, and a guy's hand shot up, and he said, "Oh, we already learned empathy." Wow, pretty impressive, Harvard. So I said, "Well, what'd you learn?" He said, "Well, it was easy. It was last year in interviewing, patient interviewing." I said, "Yeah." He said, "All you do is you repeat the 3 last words the patient said, and you nod your head." Our daughter picked this up, I think, from Janet and me at one point, and when she started doing emails, she had a tag on her emails, and it was about empathy. And she said, because empathy is basically putting yourself in another person's shoes in a feeling way. So the tag she had was, it's important to walk a mile in another person's shoes. That way you're a mile away and you have their shoes. How do you learn empathy? Well, as other person's shoes, obviously. But for doctors, it's really interesting. I heard it again today. We doctors learn empathy often if we were treated very well by a doctor when we were young, or we have a family member who is in trouble in a hospital and we see that person being treated badly. I've had the experience sitting in a corner in a room, and I think my mother was sick in a bed, and the hospital team came in not knowing I was a doctor, and how's our gal today, and sort of treating her like we sometimes treat people, and I was kind of appalled. So in medicine, you can't really PowerPoint empathy. The way you learn empathy in medicine is you watch people who are good at it. And when you find people who are good at it, and I guarantee there are some in the room, you sort of follow them around. You do rotations with them. You try to get them as a mentor, things like that. And then the final thing about staying human is learn your trade in the world. And what that means is the patient is never only the patient. The patient is the family, the friends, where the water comes from, where the garbage goes, the toxins, the climate, the whole thing. Now, when I went to medical school, out of 100 people in my class, I don't think more than 10 had ever been out of the country. The good news is that this class, your generation of doctors, young doctors, medical students, have been everywhere. They've done everything. You've been all over the world by now, and you really don't feel that strangers are strange or foreigners are foreign. It's a remarkable thing, and the diversity in medical school now is absolutely astonishing. So that's the good news. The bad news is that you're about to enter a healthcare system, those of you who are just going into it, that's a total disaster. It's a disaster. It's worse for the patients, it's worse for the doctors, it's only better for the insurance company, the insurance industry. And I have a lot to say about that. Maybe I'll hold that for questions at the end, or I can talk a little bit more at the end about it. Simply put, I'm for a national, healthcare system like every other industrialized country. The question really is, why should a healthcare system be for profit? Why should a healthcare system be for profit? And under the Shem plan, of course, we'd have a national healthcare system. We would have tort reform because so much of the cost is in cover-your-ass medicine, right? No question. And this is for the medical students and those still struggling with their $200,000 debts in medical school. Medical school will be free. Loans will be canceled retroactively from today. You see why I'm not in politics. In return for 2 years of service after you graduate somewhere in America. How many medical students would take that deal? Yeah, everybody would. It'd be exciting. It'd be fun. You'd learn medicine, and the hint about how this should happen, this could happen, because we're not going to get it from Obamacare or any other politicians. Is somebody said to me once, when you're in a theater and somebody falls down in trouble, does the cry ever go out, is there an insurance executive in the house? Right? I mean, this is the last thing I'll say and I'll move on. We are doctors. We and other healthcare workers do the work. Without us, there's no healthcare. So we can get back to that. But you're the ones, your generation is the one that's going to have to deal with this. I wanted to say one more thing I learned about the House of God before leaving it, and that is the House of God was one of these big hierarchical systems. They're called power over systems, where somebody has power over you and you have power over somebody else. And in these big systems, what happens is the pressure comes down on the lowest down people. And in the medical system, the interns were the lowest down, right? And what happens in the book, and what happens in real life too, is when the pressure comes down, the interns got isolated. Not only did they get isolated from each other, it's in the book, one goes crazy, one commits suicide, each of us got isolated from our authentic experience of the system itself, right? Each of us got isolated from our authentic experience of the system itself, right? You start to think, I'm crazy for thinking this is crazy. And that's, that immobilizes us. It's like what Chuck, the African-American intern, said, how can we care for patients if nobody cares for us? Now, given these power over systems, there's only one. These power over systems are based on a hierarchy that can be of race, gender, sexual preference, ethnicity, etc. And the only threat to a dominant group is the quality of the connections among the subordinate group. The only threat to the dominant group is the quality of connections among the subordinate group. That's why the first thing I say is stick together. Connection comes first. And connection in your internship. Don't get isolated in your internship. That's really death. So once again, the issue is connection versus isolation and somehow sticking together. Okay, I'm going to move on to... I wrote a sequel to The House of God. The publisher has tried to hide it for all these years. It's called Mount Misery. It's about the same main character going into his psychiatric residency in a big mental hospital called Mount Misery. I went into psychiatry from the Beth Israel at McLean Hospital thinking that psychiatrists were really the ones who knew how to be most human to patients and with patients, right? And guess what? Maybe it was just my experience again, but they were worse. It was really very, people during my residency were brought up for child molestation, for drinking with patients in the office, for sexual abuse of many patients, all this stuff, You can read about it in Mount Misery. But also there were some funny things that happened. Everything my work rides on two things: humor and love, or sex. Love and sex, at best. This is a true story, a little true story from Mount Misery, where Roy is admitting a psychiatric patient, a middle-aged Italian bricklayer who thinks he's God. How do you know you're God? I asked. Because I was in hell. You want proof? He unbuttoned his shirt. On his belly was a magnificent tattoo of the Last Supper. Clearly, it had been done many years before, when what was now his belly had been his chest, and when he'd been thinner, for now it had expanded so that Christ and all the apostles were all wearing broad grins. What'd you think, Doc? Asked the security guard after we'd locked him up. 298.80, brief reactive psychosis. You don't think he's God? He may be, but it's not reimbursable. And then, as I did before, this is one of these things that I wish had happened, that I wrote in a way that I wanted to make it better. I had a patient that year that was really a lot of trouble. She was always a young woman who was always challenging me, thinking I didn't know anything, which was sort of right at that time. So this is the last session that I imagined with her. Terrific, she said to me sarcastically, putting me down. She looked sullenly into her lap. In the past, I might have gotten angry at her, but suddenly I understood. The issue wasn't me or her, but us. The we in the room, which seemed so solid right then that you could shape it, yet so ephemeral that it was the unseen historical forces shaping you. My job right then was to hold this we, this connection with her, hold it for both of us. That was my job as a doctor, to use my experience with others who had suffered and my vision born of that experience to bring someone who was out on the edge of the so-called sick into the current of the human, to take what seems foreign in a person and see it as native. This is healing. This process is what the healing process is. This is what I signed up for years ago. This is what good doctors do. We're with people at crucial moments of their lives healing. And that was a little bit of an advance for me, and it leads me to the next thing I'll mention. My wife and I then started working with men and women, trying to bring them together across differences at Wellesley College at the Stone Center, Women's Center. And to be very brief, what we developed and worked on was kind of a new way of looking at psychological development and at psychological health. And to be very simple, the notion of psychological health in Western civilization has been based on the health of this thing, this person. A person is healthy, right? And the development of a healthy self is the goal of normal development. Well, that's a male model. If you talk to women, it's a little different. And what Janet basically came up with was that a measure of psychological health of a person, any one of you, can be looked at as the quality of the connections with other people. Now, that doesn't take away from being a strong self, right? In fact, think about it. A good relationship makes you feel better about yourself, right? And so you can read about that. We wrote a book called We Have to Talk, Healing Dialogues Between Women and Men, which if any of you are in relationships, which I hope you are, you know, this may be of use to you. It's on the website. But the application to medicine is pretty simple in a way. I'll give you, for instance, in psychiatry, rather than asking a patient, tell me about your mother or tell me about your father, I started asking, tell me about the connection with your mother or the connection with your father, the relationship with your mother. And all of a sudden, you're talking about the relationship. As a doctor, using the we rather than the I is very helpful. For instance, the old surgeons, the patriarchal surgeons, you know, the good old surgeons, used to say, well, I've done all the tests, and we have the results, and I'm going to operate on you. Right? That's an I-you. And it's, you know, the patient would often say, okay, you know, fine. The newer iteration is a surgeon will say, well, I've done all the tests, and I think I should operate on you, but you're welcome to get a second opinion. Not bad. But what if the surgeon said, you know, we've done all the tests, and now let's talk about what we're going to do. Now that seems like a little thing. But what you find out is if you, as the doctor, use the we, what does the patient say? She says, yeah, okay, let's talk about what we're going to do. So the use of the word concretizes the fact there's a relationship here and comes back to the person who starts using the word we. So try it with your patients. Try using the we. And certainly in surgery, studies have shown what's the main factor in whether surgeons get sued or not? The quality of the relationship. If people have a good relationship with a surgeon, they're much less likely to sue. So try using the we. It's a shift to the we. It seems like a little thing, but you will. It defines that there's a relationship here. It strengthens the relationship. The next step for me, aside from the we and the idea of the relationship, came from what you heard about before. It's a play we wrote, my wife and I, called Bill W. and Dr. Bob, about the relationship between the two men that led to the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous, 1935 in Akron, Ohio. Everybody here heard of Alcoholics Anonymous? Yeah, okay. Do students have to go to meetings and stuff now? Great, excellent. There's a current epidemic in colleges now. 2,000 college students per year die just of alcohol poisoning, not getting into cars and stuff. 5 a day die. And we're using the play, trying to use the play to do that. Okay, what's of such interest about Bill W. and Dr. Bob? Bill was a stockbroker from New York, some kind of genius. The only flaw he had was he was a drunk. Couldn't get over it. Dr. Bob was a surgeon in Akron, Ohio, Wonderful man except for one thing. He too was, they're both dying of alcoholism. They happened to meet by a series of really karmic or fate events in Akron, and Bill had the realization, he was alone in Akron, he had the realization he wanted to take a drink. The only thing that could keep him sober was telling his story to another drunk, which is kind of bizarre, right? Telling his story to another drunk would keep him sober. Didn't know if it would help the other guy. And they met, and when Bill told this to Dr. Bob, Bob wanted nothing to do with this, but when he told him in that meeting that he realized this was the only thing that could keep him sober, and that his doctor in New York, Bill's doctor, had said, he believed alcoholism was a disease, an allergic disease of some kind. And Bob stopped him and he said, a disease with signs and symptoms, a course and a progression, implying what? A treatment? And so from that moment, Bob, the doctor, put it in medical terms. And he said, we got to find this, we got to see if this treatment works, this treatment of yours works. And we've come to think that it had to be a doctor that Bill met, because that was the crucial step. There's one point in the play, they do stupid things trying to get other drunks. They chase them down in bars, they go to their houses, it's ridiculous. And finally Bob says, Bill, I figured out where we're going wrong. We need to find ourselves a steady supply of more reliable alcoholics, he says. And then he says, those already in the hospital. And so he takes it into the hospital. That was the major step. Now, why am I telling you about AA today, aside from the fact that you're all going to see alcoholics and drug addicts, they're all going to fool you, you're not going to recognize them, you're not going to treat them right. I hope you'll send them to 12-step programs as part of the treatment. Well, because these guys discovered two things that were new in the world. One, they started this whole thing we take for granted of same disease support groups, right? You have a patient with abuse, you send him or her to abuse group, etc. The other thing they discovered, they said alcoholism is a disease that has physical, psychological, and spiritual elements and has to be treated in all three ways. The start of the holistic movement, right, in medicine, 1935. So what did I learn? What's the point of AA? How does AA work? AA works because it shows the healing power of mutual connection, right? It's not an I program, it's a we program, right? The healing power of mutual connection. That's been a big step in my understanding. Okay, that's as far as I've gotten. And then the next step, the final step so far, is this new novel. It's called The Spirit of the Place. It came out a couple years ago. In the back you can't see, but the cover is an original Chagall painting. And so if you buy the book, you can cut it out and put it on your refrigerator, frame it, whatever. This book is once again one of the joys of being a fiction writer, a novelist. I always had the dream. When I grew up, I had this wonderful old doctor, one of these old-time general practitioners. I'll read you a little about him, who was very important to me in my growing up years. He was like a counselor. I went to him for advice, which he never gave. But he started to take me around with him, And that's what got me into medicine. And I always dreamed of going back to that little town, Hudson, New York, up on the Hudson River, and join him in practice, But it didn't work out. So I did the next best thing. I did it in fiction. It's about this 40-year-old guy who's been divorced, running around the world with Doctors Without Borders. And he's finally fallen in love with a dynamite, wonderful, Italian, beautiful, sexy yoga teacher. So I get to write about that. That's another joy. And he's finally kind of happy after this miserable divorce and all. But his mother back home has died. He's missed the funeral because they didn't know where he was. And he goes back and he's broke. He needs money. It turns out the terms of her will are such that he doesn't get anything unless he lives in her house in the middle of this town for a year and 13 days. And he hates this town. It's been anti-Semitic. He's Jewish. It's this broken down, horrible wreck of a town, And he thinks, well, he'll just go home and the hell with it, he'll go back to his Italian lover. But, of course, he stays, otherwise there'd be no book. I want to read a couple passages. Once again, so this is really a more general story about a doctor. Let me just see, where am I looking? Here we go. Okay, it has humor in it, as usual. This is in the winter. The town is called Columbia. Two Colombian ice fishermen and their dog had a bright idea. It was the end of January. The Hudson River was ice-locked. Even though they never caught anything much in the polluted river when it was free of ice, many Colombians imagined that when ice a foot thick covered it, the fish would reappear. Their greatest difficulty in ice fishing was not keeping warm. After all, they would drink enough beer so that it acted like antifreeze, and they would drag portable gas stoves out to their huts on the river. The difficulty was cutting through the ice. Many male Colombians had a love affair with internal combustion, and their favorite was when their manly hands were caressing a chainsaw. Yet in the dead heart of winter, a chainsaw required just that little bit extra presence of mind from inebriated Colombians to cut through the ice without shearing off a toe or a foot or a leg. At dawn on this viciously cold day, the two Colombian ice fishermen and their dog had the bright idea of using dynamite to blast their hole in the frozen river. True story now. They drove their pickup out onto the ice toward the neglected old lighthouse. They got out, all three. They managed to identify the fuse end of a stick of dynamite, congratulating themselves on their creative intelligence and hardly able to contain their excitement. One held the stick of dynamite. From his cigar, the other lit it. It sizzled a fuzzy phosphorescence. The Colombian threw the lit stick a long way away. It sailed in a high, sputtering arc out toward the decaying lighthouse. They watched, first in drunken puzzlement mixed with a hint of satisfaction at the order of the world, then in drunken horror as their dog owners, ran after the stick of dynamite, fetched it, and started barreling back toward them. See the dog run. See the Colombians run. See how fast the dog runs. See how slow the men run. So our hero is called to patch that up. Now, this is a little love portrait of this old doc that had such an important effect on me. His name is Bill Starbuck, and this is Orville goes to see him first time he's back in his office. Ushering Orville in, Bill's hand was on his shoulder. As always, Bill was a toucher, a great toucher. You might forget what he told you was wrong with you or what he was going to do about it, but you remembered that touch. Hours later, the place he'd touched still felt special, warm in winter, cool in summer. Good to see you, son, Bill said, settling in behind the big cluttered desk and another yes smoking sign. His words came out in a calm, deliberate way with significant torsion of his lips, as if each word was being molded as delicately as an egg and required care to survive. His greeting blew the scent of fresh scallions at Orville. Bill's other addiction besides nicotine was fresh scallions. When in season, his rural patients kept him supplied. Bill the Scallion Starbuck. Bill shook a Camel Free and lit up, blowing out 2 dragons of smoke. As a teenager embarked on a course of rank failure, when he refused to talk with his parents or sister about anything close to his heart, he was sent to Bill for advice. Bill never gave any advice. He sat and smoked and told stories of the 14-point buck and the gunslinging doctor and what was in the office safe. The summer after a desolate sophomore year, when Orville was bored half out of his mind and depressed out of the other half, Bill began to take him around with him, let him help out in the office, go on house calls out in the county, learn about medicine. What a time that had been, deliveries, deaths, and everything in between. The shy boy opened up to the kindly man. Orville had been enthralled by the realness of doctoring, the intense contact with people at the crucial times of their lives that often helped them heal. It was incredible for the boy to see that things actually happened in life, actually got done. And that's one of the great things about medicine. Now, staring across the desk at the old doctor, Orville realized that for Bill, too, given his suffering with his handicapped only child who had died young, their friendship had not only been an opening, but a rejuvenation. Bill got in the habit of calling Orville when there was a particularly interesting house call or emergency. Have I ever felt more at peace, Orville wondered, than in the dawn light alongside Bill in his black caddy on the drive home from delivering a baby somewhere out in a godforsaken shack in the middle of nowhere. This man had grown him up. And then Bill says at the end of their meeting, yeah, there are a lot of rumors in this town. The only person who really knows what's going on around here is me. People tell the truth in here. A fellow like me gets to lift up the lid, peek in under the edge, and see past the bullshit. And that's another reason I wanted to write this book, is because I realized that if you're any good as a doctor, if you really listen empathically, you will hear the truth. You'll hear the truth from your patient. It may take a while, a couple of visits, but you'll hear the truth. And the truth is usually the best clue to diagnosis, even now. And also, in our society, the other thing about being a doctor in a small town is you hear the truth in your office and then you hear the lies socially when you're mixing with people, which is kind of interesting. And in the era when truth is less and less a cherished commodity in our society, given all of the advertising and political stuff, as a doctor, it's very rewarding to be in that reality, right? And the last thing, as I said, every book I write is a love story, and this is one. He's finally stayed in the town, and for a while, part of that year, it's still the winter, and he's fallen in love with a historian named Miranda. And this is after they've had their first intimate contact. But he's on call. His beeper roused him at 2 a.m, the delivery ward, something urgent. The nurse had paged him for a delivery of twins. He'd been tending the couple through the pregnancy, her first. They were poor and black, a man and woman he'd known vaguely as a girl and boy. There's something wrong, the night nurse was saying. Come quick. Wrong big time, he realized. The tap of death on a baby's shoulder. He explained that he'd have to do an emergency C-section. The couple agreed. He scrubbed in fast and did the section. Twin boys. One was well-formed, robust, squalling. The other was microcephalic, its head the size of a doll's, but with lips and nose and eyes crammed together and with no forehead, giving it a frog-like look. Trunk and legs normal, but for a remnant of tail. It was horrible to see, yet transfixing, like something you see in a bottle of formaldehyde in a medical museum. The nurse took the healthy baby to the father, leaving Orville to wait for the other to die. Luckily and quietly, by the time he had gotten done with closing the groggy new mother's abdomen, it did. Orville went out to the father. He was still holding the healthy baby in that awkward way that new fathers do. The nurse had told him the other had died. What happened? The man asked in shock. The other baby lived only a few minutes. It was deformed. Can I see him, Doc? Orville hesitated. The older doctor in him, the good old Doc Starbuck, would have patted him on the shoulder and said, no, son, better you don't. The younger doctor applauded his wish, though knowing that once seen, it would be indelible. Orville said, you can, sure. I just want you to know that you'll never forget it. Him, the man said. I want to see him. The nurse took the healthy baby, and Orville and the father went in together to see the other son. He'd been cleaned up, so he looked better, less frightening. The father reached out a hand and touched the perfect shoulder and then the squashed head. He bowed his own head and crossed himself. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, amen. He looked up at Orville. His eyes were wet, sorrowful. He said, thank you. And you, Orville said, feeling in this man the power of facing into in a world that as a rule turns away. I think she'll want to see him too. Fine. The father picked up the dead baby to take him to his mother. Orville got beeped away to tend to a drug overdose from the Bliss Towers housing project and a stabbing victim from a happy household and a car crash and several Christmas specials, including a shepherd from Austerlitz sure he was picking up Radio Free Europe through a metal plate recently placed in his skull. Sort of a normal night. Later, during a break in the action, he walked out into the parking lot and searched in his pockets for the half-smoked peyote cigar and matches. The night was crisp. The little town was iced up, and the air tasted like cold quarters and seemed stretched tight as an eardrum, so it was like you could hear everything. He thought of the dead twin, who would always be almost there, floating there like all the dead, and the live twin. He thought of Miranda, of her histories and of their lovemaking, and he whispered out loud, this is the one that will survive. So, when you write a novel, you really don't know what it's about, you know? you're not interested in what it's about because you're so involved in the characters and the story, and it's kind of writing itself, et cetera, and you're using all of my 40 years of skill at this. Until somebody tells you what it's about. So a friend of ours, a woman, said, "Hey, you know what this is about?" And I said, "What?" She said, "Well, it's about this youngish doctor, who comes back to heal the town, and the town heals him." Heal is an interesting word. Heal goes both ways, to heal, right? And that's right. And one of the reviewers said about this book that it's a perfect bookend to the House of God, because the House of God is on the wards, and it shows you kind of how to get through that experience. This is about how you be a doctor in a town, in your life. This is how to be a doctor in your life, kind of, right? And what happens is this guy comes back to this broken down, horrible town, and he's forced to be in relationship, be in connection with a whole slew of these townspeople, and he can't leave. And through that process, something else happens. And so this book is really about something more basic than the others. It's a story not just for doctors, but for everybody. And it's about suffering. We all suffer. Everybody's going to suffer. You can't get around that. That's the first noble truth of the Buddha, right? There is suffering. The issue is not the suffering. The issue is how you walk through it. If, as one model of this is if you decide, and this is more the male model, I'm going to gut it out, I'm going to stick it out, I'm going to, get through this no matter what, myself, you're going to suffer more and you're going to spread more suffering around. And one of the things this hero hears at a crucial point in this book, it's like he hears a voice in his head when he has to make a decision, and it says, don't spread more suffering around. Whatever you do, don't spread more suffering around, which is not a bad thing for doctors to know too, right? Don't spread more suffering around. If you walk through it alone, you're going to spread more suffering around. If, on the other hand, you walk through the crucible of suffering with others, with caring others, and that's where we come in, right? As I said, these crucial moments where we're there. If you walk through this crucible of suffering with caring others, you will suffer less and you will not spread as more suffering around. And you might even come out of it with more understanding and even redemption. Thank you.
Obviously this book was written in, sounds like you're trained in the 70s, and there's been a lot of changes trying to make the practice of residency and internship more humane with work hour limitations and different bureaucratic, as well as, sort of mentoring type approaches. How different do you think it is now compared to then as far as fomenting physicians who have empathy and are better suited to care for patients?
Well, that's a good question. It's better and it's worse. I mean, I know there's a lot of controversy about limiting hours, and there are good arguments on both sides, actually. I'm not sure exactly where I come down. But I do know from my experience, and it's written in the House of God, and anybody who's been on call every other night for a while knows, the worst thing for you and the patient is if you're exhausted, if you can't think straight, And so I applaud limiting hours. Although, as I say, I know there are other sides to that argument, especially among surgeons. What do they say in the House of God? The only problem with admitting every other patient is you only get to do half the operations or something like that. The things that are better are, number one, women in medicine. When I was my class of 100 had 10 women, 10. And now it's 50 or 60% in every medical school I've been at. And the good thing about that is that women are valued more in the culture for the qualities of empathy, care, concern, maintaining relationships, those kinds of things. And those things do translate into the hospital environment. I think we have seen that in some ways. the problem in terms of really getting those kinds of ways of being with patients, more embedded in the culture of the hospitals and the academic institutions, is that there are many, many fewer, as you know, women who stay in the system to become professors or administrators than there are men. So that kind of gets lost, and there are certain reasons for that. But women is one big thing. I think that's helped. Another thing is the whole thing that we used to call the New Age movement, which is now taken for granted. All these other ways of helping patients, you know. I mean, acupuncture, I didn't know what acupuncture was when I was an intern, you know. You name it, there are all these meditation, you know. John Kabat-Zinn's work on using meditation, you may have heard of it, in you know, helping to reduce stress, all of that stuff. Anyway, that's another thing that's better now. I mean, I worked for a while in a biotech investment company. And so we saw all of the last 10 years of, you know, the greatest inventions all over the world in bio. The things that we can do now, you know, I'm the proud possessor of a really good hip and, you know, other things. You know, the things we can do now are amazing. They're absolutely amazing. The technology for how we can deal with, you know. The other thing that I think is a great movement is the hospice movement. That never existed back then either. You know, we didn't know what to do with these aging people. And there's a whole new field, you know, there's a whole field of gerontology. So there are a lot of very good things that have happened. There are a lot of things that are not good. One is just the direction of society where families are fragmented. You can't, you know, you don't have contact with patients for an extended period of time. The patients don't usually live where their supports live, that whole thing. You know, I've already mentioned, I think we've got it backwards in terms of what good health care is, really. You know, I mean, there are starting to be some movements, but preventive care is so much more important in some ways. You know, I mean, where do we start? Talk about what people eat. You know, talk about what people eat. And the inequality in eating. I heard just one statement on the radio yesterday, driving in the car. In the 50s, the poorest segment of the population ate the best. And the upper classes ate the worst, you know, and now it's absolutely different. And as you know, I mean, if there are any diabetologists or people, I mean, there is going to be this tsunami, right? This tsunami of obesity associated diseases. So on a lot of different fronts, I really am worried. You know, we have the capacity to really save people and do better, but you know, in the bigger world, we're going to have a hard time delivering that. We really are. And one other just quick thing about healthcare. You know, we have a house in Costa Rica, my wife and I, and you know, we chose it partly because it's a country that in 1948, by constitution, said that they could not have an army. Okay? Now you have to understand, I was born in 1944. From the day I was born until what looks like an extension past 2014 that Obama announced last night in Afghanistan, right? What is that? That's, how many years is from 44 to 2014? So, you know, for a lot of years, my whole life, this country's been at war. Mostly declared, sometimes not, you know. And Costa Rica uses all the money that they would have had for the Department of Defense in maintaining an army. They have an incredible healthcare system, free, totally free. They have a good educational system that's free. I mean, in this little village down the mountain, somebody was with us, hurt their head, brought him down there, you know, it's a bit severe laceration, walked into this little tiny clinic, immaculate, just like the best you'd see around here, fully trained doctor, fully trained nurse, fully trained pharmacist, saw him, did everything right, pharmacist handed him antibiotics, and boom, that was it. I mean, you can't have it both ways, you know. I mean, I think the biggest problem for healthcare in this country is, you know, over half of my tax money going for the Department of Defense. And of course, the other big tsunami that's going to hit us are the vets, you know, the vets from these two wars now who have, as everybody knows, horrible, lasting intensive care diseases. I don't know where that money's going to come from. You know, the VA is one of the best systems. Anyway, better and worse. The best of times and the worst of times. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have a two-part question. The first part is about the inner world, and the second part is about the outer world.
Good.
So the first part, it sounds like most of your career you've been juggling being a writer and being a doctor, and I was wondering if you ever experienced a tension of wanting to be a good doctor and wanting to be a good writer, and if those were competing with each other. I mean, it sounds like one informed the other, in both ways. And so how did you deal with that tension if you had it? Because time to spend on one thing is time away from the other. And my second part...
Let's do the first one first. Okay. I'll forget it, that's why. That's a very good question, and for any of you who want to be writers as doctors. You know, you find out what your passion is, and mine was, I'm happiest when I'm writing, so that was gonna survive. You have to be, I think you have to be practical. If you want to write things from your heart, then you have to have another job. You know, I mean, I faced that choice. If I wanted to be a writer and support myself, I would go to Hollywood or, you know, TV or movies. That's where the money is. But I didn't want to do that. It was too important to me, you know. So then it's a question of, okay, what job can you choose? And for me, as I said, it was, you know, I'd already been accepted at Harvard Med. And I loved medicine. I didn't like the preclinical years, but once I got into the clinic, I loved it. My heroes were doctors as writers. You know, Chekhov was the greatest doctor-writer. I have a letter from him up over my desk, you know, and many others. You have to find something that will allow you, well, if you want to write what I write, which are novels, which are long things that take a lot of years, or plays, which also, if you do it right, take time, you need something that will allow you time every day. If you notice, there are no, to my knowledge, maybe I'm wrong, there are no surgeons who have written really good long, I mean, you know, quality long novels, or novels. You know, you don't see surgeons very often writing novels that are, you know, they write thrillers and stuff, but I mean things that really, you know, might be around for a while. Like, you know, my friend and wonderful writer, Altuve Wande, you know, he does what most surgeons do. He writes short pieces, you know, essays, a book of essays, nonfiction. I think also one thing you might want to learn if you're thinking of becoming a writer, if you're a doctor, I'm firmly convinced that you either have a nonfiction brain or you have a fiction brain. I do not have a nonfiction brain. It kills me to write nonfiction. I like, you know, going places that way. So, you know, if you want to write nonfiction things, then it doesn't matter what you choose in medicine because you can write essays, short stories, etc. That'll work. If you want to write longer things, I think you have to choose something that will allow you time every day. And I was delighted to find that with psychiatry, I could have the mornings free. Now, that sounds easy, but it was very difficult. I had to learn to, it's like you know, you do physical exercise. I had to do emotional exercise to, you know, write fully in the morning and stop, you know, around 11 or so, and then switch to, you know, listening to people fully in the afternoon. And it didn't work sometimes. I'd be sitting there with a patient, and, you know, I think it's one of the novels I had been working on is in China, set in China. I'm thinking I'm still in China. So it's a skill to learn. I think you can be good at both, but it's wearing. It's much easier now. For about 5 years, I have just been a writer. But I'm afraid, in this day and age especially, unless you write crap, you need another job. You know, it's amazing what's happened in publishing now. You know, it's the thing that publishers are looking for now. Mostly, frankly, sounds like kind of sophisticated blogs. You know, they literally are looking for, they go and search blogs of people to turn into even fiction. Anyway, what's the second question?
Well, you led into my second question, which was the practical, how you write daily, question what time you wake up in the morning and what kind of practice you have in the afternoon that allows you to take the mornings off and
Yeah.
Just the practical, and just like, I appreciate the discipline you're saying that.
Well, I'll tell you a little more detail. I mean, I think if you're planning to, this is for all of those who want to also be a writer. I mean, if you're planning to try writing, you have to find for yourself what is the best time for you to work and how many hours, and, you know, do you use your typewriter? I know you don't. Actually, you know, I have been part of this, so anyway, I have been part of the revolution because I certainly worked on a typewriter. And then I was one of the first to get, anybody here remember a Wang word processor? They had a great word processing program about 1982 or something. So I made the shift. I think this is going to be a lot easier. You know, and actually my friend John Updike, he was so impressed by this, you know. He thought, gee, I can be more productive too. He's the most productive writer we ever had. So he got one. And guess what? It made it harder to write for me. It took longer. Guess why? Because in the past, when you were on a typewriter, and if you had to redo if you had to make a correction, and you had to retype the whole damn page, you were pretty damn ready by the time you got to type that you knew what you were going to do. Not everything, but you knew pretty, you know, your intensity before you hit the screen. Now, as our daughters tell us, you know, boom, everything's up on the screen. You think you can fix it later, and in nonfiction you can. In fiction, it's a lot more difficult. But anyway, you find the way that you write. Most people do it in the morning. And then you have to find out, you know, once you get your, whatever media, whatever you're doing, what kind of writing, fiction, nonfiction, etc. How do you rewrite? Because as I said, I have to do these things 7 times. I take comfort from the fact that Tolstoy had to rewrite War and Peace 7 times. Actually, that's not quite true. His wife rewrote it. He dictated to her. It was finally got to the point where his editor kept wanting to revise, and his editor said, "Will you stop your infernal scribbling?" It's a great book. So you know how much you have to rewrite, and you know the emotional, how you do it, how you get that critic out of your head. You know. Maybe one more, and then we'll. Yeah, go ahead. And we'll stop.
Thank you. Big fan of your stuff.
Thank you.
I had a question. A recent survey just came out this weekend said that 54% of doctors, if they had to do it again, wouldn't. So I have a 2-part question for you. One, reading The House of God made it seem like I was actually shocked at how low that number was. It seemed to me that most of the characters in The House of God didn't seem like they would do it again. They could have had a very difficult process to go through and very humanizing. Do you think it's gotten better in that sense? As the first question. The second question is,
repeat that. I didn't quite get it. What's gotten better?
do you think medical education in general, the process of becoming a doctor, has become, do you see this as kind of the process getting better or getting worse? The second question is, if you personally had to do medicine again, which?
Yeah, those are good questions. The medical education has, I think, gotten better and worse. I think the preclinical years, you know, all the different ways they're being taught now with more of a awareness of actual patients. I think that's all better. I really do. You know, there's so much that you really don't have to. Well, okay. Someone once said to me, you forget information, but you never forget what you understand. And you know, I still remember my first interview patient in medical school. You know, like where Kennedy was shot. Where were you when Kennedy was shot? Or where the World Trade Towers. It's an interesting thing in the brain. You never forget something that's linked to an emotion. So I think that's a key thing to medical education now, and I think it's a much kinder, gentler way, and all the New Age stuff and meditation for stress and all this come in. I don't think that the clinical years, I mean, I'm not in it so much right now, but I have been up until I don't think the clinical years are much better. I really don't, because these systems, as I said, well, shift that a little bit. I think the smaller medical schools, it's better, because they focus more on the kinder, gentler specialties, maybe like family medicine or things like that, pediatrics. Harvard, you know, at Harvard, it's probably the most, in a culture, as de Tocqueville noticed, is very self-centered. It's the most self-centered of the self-centered. So I noticed, you know, in Mount Misery, these people are sitting there interviewing their patients with an eye on what paper they can publish. You know, they're half with their patient. And that won't work. So in the big medical academic centers, I think it's worse because there's this tremendous competition for grants, promotions, et cetera. And the other factors I said. But I have come across really wonderful training programs that go right through residency, and they're usually, well, I just think of one, like in North Dakota. I spoke there, and the whole last year, they try to train. There are several states, actually, where they really put an emphasis on, if you go to this school, we expect you to go back and practice in this state. Southern Illinois University of North Dakota Medical School. In the last year, both of those things, I think they absolutely find a doctor and work with them for a year, and that's a wonderful experience. They're ready to go. I mean, one of the real good changes, I think, in my lifetime in medicine is that it used to be that doctors would make the most money and have the most prestige in their communities, right? Every survey. The rich people in my town were doctors, and they had the most prestige. That ain't so anymore. And that's kind of good, because people are coming into, 60% from Harvard go into finance every year. But the people who go into medicine now, they're doing it because they want to be doctors, most of them. And they bring those skills there. But would I do it again? Well, that's as I said, I'm not sure I'm not sure that my choice was very relevant here. I'll tell you one last piece of that. When I graduated from medical school and was thinking of doing an internship, I knew I wanted to be a psychiatrist at that time, right? And I could have gone directly into my psychiatric training without ever having done any medicine in a hospital, right? I could have skipped a whole year. But I said, look, for some reason, I said, look, I want to know how to do this. I've spent all my life, I was still afraid of writing an order to give aspirins to a patient. They weren't trained in sub-internships in those days. We knew nothing. At Harvard, we knew so little at Harvard Med from our clinical rotations that the most attended course was just before we graduated, somebody, I forget his name, ran a 2-day course in all the things you really had to know to go into your internship. Everybody's there, right? But I didn't have to do an internship a medical internship. But I wanted to wanted to be able to say, I'm a doctor, I know how to treat patients. And actually I moonlit after that, after the internship. Well, guess what? If I hadn't made that choice, there'd be no novel. I probably never would be here. I know I never would be here. I would have been writing plays, and not doing very well. So, it's hard to say. I'm thrilled at the way it's worked out. Those are good questions. Thank you. Thank you. Now everybody can 5 up.